The subject is a really interesting one, I think. I think that Elisha is an interesting character. He's full of surprises, and he's full of tremendous passion. And he comes, of course, from the stock of Elijah, insomuch that Elijah was his father in the truth. And the fire that was Elijah certainly came into the life of Elisha. Though Elijah seems to be, while he was living, certainly the senior figure of the two. But it's a very interesting part of the Bible. Have you ever thought of this? If we would take the beginning of Elijah's life, we come back to Elijah's life, to chapter 17. So let's put just a hand there for a moment. And then come to 2 Kings, say, chapter 9. And within that section, quite a few pages, isn't it? Within that section, a section of the book called The Kings. The kings are eclipsed. The royal families are overdone. It's the prophets that take the front. And it's particularly Elijah and Elisha. There's no other part, is there, of the Kings or Chronicles where that's the case. The rest of those records and those chapters, yes, they follow the king. The royal family is the dominant focus of the account. But not in these chapters. It's Elijah and Elisha that dominate those many pages. It's a unique period in Israel's history. Judah's history or the history of Israel. And it happens, of course, in the north of Israel, which makes it even all the more interesting. But I've never seen it quite like that before, and I find that to be very, very interesting, that that's a unique part of the scripture in which the prophet of God was actually leading the tune and the nations were responding to the leadership that was provided. Unique, absolutely unique. So it's unique people that were required to be able to do that. So in 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse 1, Elijah's on the scene with great surprise. We don't know where he came from, except it says he was a Tishbite, which doesn't seem to mean much to any historian. Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, is said unto Ahab, as Yahweh, God of Israel, liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these 3 years, but according to my word. Right from the start, he's a man of authority. He's a man that comes with strong direction from his God, and he's prepared to stand up. I mean, that could hardly be a less popular message, could it? And yet there he is, telling king and the country at large that he's come to bring a sense of famine that they had not known for a long time. For 3.5 years it was, that we are told by James. But Elisha doesn't hit the front until we come quite a bit later on in 1 Kings 19. And there we have a little bracket of verses. 1 Kings, chapter 19, verse 19. And it says there how he departed thence, that's Elijah, and found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he with the 12th. And Elijah passed by him and cast his mantle upon him. Elijah's been caught out, in a sense. He's right down at Mount Sinai. He's having a real complaint. He says, nobody's standing up for things except me. In fact, he's extremely bold about it. In verse 10, we have his statement. 1 Kings 19 and verse 10, and he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts. For the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets. He's got the adjectives in the right description, hasn't he? All the things about my God, thy covenant, thine altars, thy prophets. I've stood up for all of that. I have. And I, even I only, am left. And they seek my life to take it away. And even after he's been somewhat tuned because of such a forward, arrogant form of words that really despises all the rest. You know, there's God and me and the rest of you. That's really his dissection of the community. But the still small voice is appealing to him to awaken to a wider view, to a different kind of ministration. But you know, despite that, verse 14, it says, and he said, I have been very jealous for Yahweh, God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenants, thrown down thine altars, slain thy prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take. That's exactly the same, isn't it, as verse 10. Despite the lesson in between, he hasn't got it at all. He just repeats it almost defiantly. He's trying to tell God why what he's doing is so wrong and what a bad deal that he has received from this. Despite his zeal, that's how he saw it. And he had, I would say, the arrogance to actually repeat that to God at that time. That's Elijah. Amazing man. Absolutely amazing man. That he said that and lived, I suppose, is in itself quite remarkable. Then he was given a commission. It's in verses 15 to 17. There was 3 points to that commission. Verse 15, and the Lord said unto him, go return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus. Do you think Elijah received that too well? Last place on earth that he wanted to go to was Damascus, to the Gentiles. Why? He couldn't find anyone in northern Israel to be his companion. To go be sent to Damascus, well, he certainly wasn't interested in such a mission. He hadn't even started, he thought, with northern Israel. And there he was to anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. The second of the commissions is in verse 16. And Jehu, the son of Nimshi, shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel. So there's a duty in Israel. And it's to anoint Jehu to remove the house of Ahab. And thirdly, Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel Maholah, shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room. And you know that Elijah didn't really do 2 out of those 3. He did the third. He anointed Elisha, as it follows in verses 19 downwards. But of the other 2, he never did them. It wasn't he that went to Damascus. It wasn't he that went back to Israel and converted Israel. The one that he did fulfill was in the appointment of Elisha. So in this very brief account, and this is the first words we have about Elisha, verse 19, it says that he departed thence, did Elijah, found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he with the 12th. And Elijah passed by him and cast his mantle upon him. What do you make of that? He hasn't really said hello to the man, has he? He hasn't been to knock on his door. He's just passing. He sees this young man at the end of this 12 yoke of oxen, and he casts a mantle of responsibility upon him. There doesn't seem to be any introduction at all. In normal respects, we would say that's a very impolite way to greet a friend, particularly someone that you want to take up a very difficult commission. But there's not a word. The young man gets no understanding of what it was all about. He must have been a fairly well-to-do person, because it says he was ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen. A yoke of oxen is like a tractor for a farmer in these days. So you're looking at a farmer that's running a fair bit of interests. You might say he was like a farmer with 6 tractors, so to speak. He was in a fairly good, comfortable way. And the place that he lived indicated that it was good ground. Abel Meholah, which means the prairie of dancing, of happiness, joy, good country, good growth, very fruitful area. And he had quite a property, and he was working on that property. It doesn't say that he found him with his eyes in the Word of God, but his mind was. But he was a practical, working young man farmer at that stage. And he obeyed the sense of Elijah's call. He left the oxen and ran after Elijah. Elijah hasn't even stopped to sort of explain anything. He had to run after him. He's left with this mantle and he wonders whatever all this means. But Elijah's 20 yards down the road now already. He's on his way. Done what he had to do. An enormous commission that he'd given this young man. And yet he didn't even see the sense or need to explain it. I don't like to put some adjectives to that, but it doesn't seem very concerned about others, does it? He's very much involved in his own world. And in desperation, Elisha says, "Let me, I pray thee, kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow thee." But he's saying to a person who's on his way. And he said unto him, "Go back again, for what have I done to thee?" Finally, Elijah gets the point that he's really brought a very difficult matter to a young man that's going to change his life completely, absolutely completely. And that perhaps that wasn't altogether a nice way to do it. Surely the young man should be able to kiss his father and his mother because he was going to be departing for good. This was not a part-time job. "Go back again," then he says, "for what have I done to thee?" But Elijah doesn't stay around even then. I don't think anybody would really quite act like that here, would we? We wouldn't even dare to think like that. Perhaps it's the kindest thing we can say is that Elijah was so consumed with the mission that God had given him that he couldn't be delayed by niceties. He just named the fact and left it with him. But Elisha did things quite properly in saying goodbye to mum and dad. He returned back from him, verse 21, which means he must have gone on quite a way, and took a yoke of oxen and slew them, and boiled their flesh with the instruments of the oxen, and gave unto the people, and they did eat. So this is not a 5-minute recall back to mum and dad, is it? This is a matter of some hours. If you're going to take a yoke of oxen and slay them, and then divide all that up after you've cooked the meal, there's got to be hours involved in that. Elisha did things as he thought they should be. But he certainly got the message. Those oxen that were taken virtually was his living. There they are in verse 19. It's the first thing we know about him is ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen. Now they're eating the oxen. They've been killed and prepared, and now they're eating them, and that's his celebration. So that by the time he's finished, the instruments of his industry is a pile of ashes. And they've all partaken of that. What a unique way to leave the family. What an incredible concept that was. There's his innings. That's his income. That was going to be his future. His intended future was now a pile of ashes. And what it also meant to his parents was, I'm not coming back. That's over. I've completed it. That's one phase of my life, but this is where I'm going. And that must mean, my dear brothers and sisters, that Elisha had, even if not a friend in Elijah, and obviously he didn't at that stage, yet he knew what Elijah's message was, and he knew what the message of the scriptures was. He knew that. And he was a young man of tremendously strong persuasion about that. It must mean that, mustn't it? Or he would never destroy those oxen. He would have said to Mum, get a few sandwiches and we'll have a little celebration and we'll be off or something. No, wasn't like that at all. All the instruments that were valuable, would you put several tractors together and put a bit of petrol to them and destroy them? That's effectively what he did. He collapsed his life in the company of Elisha. Well, we imagine Elijah's still there. Elijah's still there. But we can't be sure about it because it says at the end of verse, then he arose and went after Elijah and ministered unto him. He poured water into the hands of Elijah, as one of the other records puts it. He was like a servant, really, to Elijah, this highly talented young son. And now he's going to be the servant, effectively, to Elijah. I don't think he would have got too many, gentle expressions in such an occupation. Elijah's mind was in another place. Then we are told nothing more until we come to our chapter that we read today. As we do, we pass over some interesting things. I just wanted to mention this. He said, didn't he? He said to God, I'm the only one around. The rest, you can count them out. As we go along, we come to chapter 20, and there the king of Israel, of the northern king, he's in war with a man called Ben-Hadad. And Ben-Hadad was a Syrian. And in this chapter, have you noticed just how many times a prophet turns up on the scene? Look at verse 13. Behold, there came a prophet unto Ahab, king of Israel, and gives him a hopeful message. It was successful. The battle was successful. Well, there's one prophet that hadn't been counted, one of the 7,000. But verse 22 has another one. Perhaps he was the same one. The prophet came to the king of Israel and said. But there's another one in verse 28. There's 4 in the chapter. So Elijah's arithmetic was not only poor, but his sense of value of people that were there is not very fundamentally good at all. And back in the capital, in Jezreel, there was at least 100 of prophets that were stored there by the person who was the prime minister of the king, Ahab's prime minister. And he was looking after them, feeding them in a cave by 50 in a cave. And he's the prime minister. Jezebel goes past every now and again. Imagine the quality of faith that man had. Amazing man. One whiff of that to Jezebel and he'd be gone. And those 100 in the cave, they'd be gone too. Elijah doesn't seem to even know that they existed. How amazing is that? So when we turn over to our chapter that we read this afternoon, 2nd of Kings chapter 2, there's nothing really about Elisha until we get to this chapter from the section that we read in chapter 19. And here Elisha really comes into the picture. But I want us to make this point too, that if that's the situation of chapter 17 and 18, Mount Carmel, where he says that he was the only one, there's been an awful lot of work done between then and now. Because in this chapter, we're going to find well, it seems almost like half a city is the prophets. And there's 4 of them. Gilgal and Bethel and Jericho, down to Jordan. There's batches of prophets in all of those circumstances. At one point here it mentioned, didn't it, in verse 7, there were 50 men of the sons of the prophets. 50 men in a crew, all prophets. Elijah's arithmetic was not very good at all. Came to pass then, verse 1, when Yahweh would take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. So this is the end of Elijah's ministration. And that's why I emphasise about the growth of the prophets in between. Between the earlier chapter to chapter 17 and 18, and this chapter, a lot of work must have gone on. Because now we have prophets building homes and developing their cities. And the work of Elijah that's yet to be seen again in the future is based upon that fact. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, and verse 17 says that this was a fulfillment of the work of Elijah in the future. There is to be a future of work for Elijah. Because the one who is to come in the future will be in the spirit and power of Elijah. In this case, it was John the Baptist. But it was in the spirit and power of Elijah. You and I would be looking at that record pretty scarce to find out where we see Elijah sitting down with someone with an open Bible. But he must have. And he must have been involved in the development of those schools of prophets. So it's important. Because Elijah's going to come yet again, isn't he? In the redemption of Israel. So he has had a vast experience in the conversion of Israelites towards the truth. But if we didn't pick up those little inferences of all these occurrences of prophets, we would miss that. And I hadn't seen that clearly until recently, I admit myself. I'd often thought, well, Elijah, but you know, he wasn't too happy about getting out there and working with people. But he obviously must have, because this would not be so as it is. So what do we find in this chapter of departure? He leaves from Gilgal. It says that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. So the two of them are working together, have been in each other's company for some years. And then Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. And that's the first of 4 towns that are mentioned in this section. Gilgal, because that's where circumcision first took place when Israel came into the land. It's down on the flat of Jordan. And it was a well-known place, and at one time Samuel used that when he gathered all Israel together. So it had a history of affinity with God and the work of God. And Elisha comes with Elisha from Gilgal. Gilgal was one of his centres. He had 3 centres, and Gilgal was one of them. You know how Samuel had that little route that he took each year? Well, obviously Elijah had something quite similar. When you put this together, you can see that that's the case. And it means too that Elijah is following a pattern which was established by Samuel. Quite a few times in the scripture, in the New Testament, it speaks about Samuel and all the prophets. Samuel and the prophets that came. Because Samuel was really the one who did start it off. It was in his time that the school of the prophets became obvious in Israel. So Elijah, despite his coming onto the scene, was not, however, the one who first developed the school of the prophets. Those 3 references in the New Testament obviously imply that with Samuel there was something new that was developed, and that is schools of brethren who were total, full-time in commitment to the things of God and the teaching of Israel. So Elijah's picking that up and building that up. But he has the unfortunate record that still goes on to this day, saying he didn't even know who was there. And Paul picks all that up in Romans, and he says that Elijah, in fact, he petitioned against Israel, and he did, didn't he? I only am left. Wow. That's not very comely at all. However, This is his last day. And Elijah said unto Elisha, verse 2, tarry here, I pray thee, for Yahweh has sent me to Bethel. And Elisha said unto him, as Yahweh liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. So they went down to Bethel. Now Bethel was a place of many things in the Old Testament too, like Gilgal was too. They were important places with interesting historical backgrounds. Bethel was a place of the prophets, obviously. They were here. It says, verse 3, the sons of the prophets that were at Bethel came forth to Elisha and said unto him, knowest thou that Yahweh will take away thy master from thy head today? And he said, yea, I know it. Hold ye your peace. But what was the last recorded event about Bethel? The last recorded event about Bethel was that Jeroboam had set up golden calves, one in the north and the other in the south in Bethel. So that wasn't without fair cost, was it? He was going into a centre of apostasy. Jeroboam was developing an apostasy, and that was a key element of it. But earlier, in the times of the patriarchs, Bethel was a place that God was found. Jacob, he slept at Bethel. And so much was the company of the angels around him that he called the place the house of God, Bethel. So for it to now come back into another season of God developing young men is in keeping with the record. But there's opposition there. The king's place of worship was in Bethel, and he was a devotee to Baal. He was an evil man, very evil man. Jezebel was around the place, fairly close. So Bethel and Gilgal had two different courses of life, and they lived alongside each other for some time. But now, obviously, there was quite a company of people in Bethel. And the sons of the prophets come out to meet Elijah and Elisha. What did they mean when they said, knowest thou that the Lord will take away thy master from thy head today? They say it there, and they say it again in verse 5. They obviously knew that that was the fact. If they were prophets, then it would seem that God had revealed to them that this is a day, a special day, in which Elijah is going to be taken and Elisha is going to be left without his mentor. It describes him in this way, that he will take away thy master from thy head today. What's that really saying? He's saying your mentor that you've relied upon will be taken from you today. But why would they say that to him? Didn't he know that? Were they adding salt to injury? It's peculiar, isn't it? I suppose even in the company of the prophets, there was some anxiety at a new appointment. Who could replace Elijah? You would like to be asked, would you, to fill the shoes of Elijah? How would you do that? And I suppose the company of the prophets that were very fervent would have said, well, can anybody do Elijah's job? He's still got plenty of steam. Why is he being taken away? And so they speak to the man who's going to inherit his office, and they ask him, do you know really what's going on? That today will be your last day with your master Elijah? I don't think that's very comforting to him at all, is it? There doesn't seem to be anything else they want to talk about. Perhaps they didn't really think Elisha was the right man. And Elijah said unto him, Elisha, tarry here, I pray thee, for Yahweh has sent me to Jericho. So he doesn't sit still, he says he's off to Jericho, which is right down, of course, close to the river Jordan. And he says furthermore that Yahweh has sent me to Jericho. He's so busy. And Elisha is desperate to have his company. This is a very interesting thing to contemplate. If you were Elisha, how would you feel? You've left everything. You're not married. Got no family. And Elijah's been just an enormous tower of strength in the country. Everything was back to Elijah. Whatever he said was what happened. And you've been asked to take his mantle. You feel as though you needed a bit of a comfort for the job, wouldn't you? You'd like to feel that people that were going to be your employees, as it were, your people that you were cooperating with, that they were friendly towards you. But I think there's a note in that says they're trying to tell him something. And of course he knew what they were trying to tell him. He knew better than they. But why did they repeat it again? And it happened wherever he went. And so in verse 4 again, he said, as Yahweh liveth and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. Why wouldn't he leave? Why would he go the last little trek with Elijah? Why did he say, look, Elijah, I know what's happening. I know what is going to occur. See you later now. I'm sorry to lose your company, but I know you're on your way. But he didn't do that. It seems, doesn't it, that the continuity between Elijah to whoever it was going to be was a huge issue for the school of the prophets. They had policy. They had a way of life. They had their families all had a way of life. There was the families of the schools of the prophets, and they had developed, I'm sure, a way of life which they were very keen to maintain. And the person that would come and be the head of the prophets really had to share those convictions, or they'd be a little bit unsure about where things were going in the future. And so they keep on saying that to him. But it wasn't very comforting for the man coming along. Knowest thou not that Yahweh will take away thy master? It's even put like that, isn't it? The one you've depended upon and we've depended upon. How do you feel about that? From thy head? Will you give the leadership to our cause? But Elisha is completely resolved. Yea, I know it. Hold ye your peace. So he's not without a bit of strength of mind either, is he, Elisha? He tells him straight, you hold your peace. I know what I'm doing. And what's more, I'm not going to let Elijah out of my sight. Why would you think that he had to actually stay with Elijah, sort of to get the job kind of thing? Because I think of the issue of continuity of that very special group of people that God was working through. And so there had to be seen that there was a God-given continuity between the older man and the younger man. And Elisha obviously understood that. And he knew that they'd be looking on to sort of see what was happening. And so he says, well, I'm not leaving Elijah until the last minute. I will be there right to the very end. And there'll be a continuity, and he'll depart and I'll be there. But I'll be there right to the end. I won't go off shopping for a while or some other thing that might be of interest to me. No way. His mind was absolutely set on the importance of the role that was coming his way. I think the others probably thought, well, we'll see. Has this man really got what's necessary for what is needed in the job? So he comes down to Jordan, to the river Jordan, in verse 3. Elisha said unto him, tarry, I pray thee here, for the Lord has sent me to Jordan. On he goes again. He won't sit still. And he said, as Yahweh liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. And they too went on. Now, going down to Jordan, and we might think, well, why did they need to go to Jordan? Were they thirsty or what was it? Why did they have to go to Jordan? And 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood to view afar off. And they too stood by Jordan. So down there at Jordan, amidst all that roughage around the river of Jordan, back here there's a little bit of higher ground. And on that higher ground there's 50 of the prophets. And they got their eye dead on these two people, whose image is getting less and less in the distance. And they are watching everything that happened, totally concentrating on whatever might happen. Could they really have a school of prophets without an Elijah? And then the story unwinds. Elijah took his mantle, his own mantle, which represented his office, and wrapped it together and smote the waters, and they were divided hither and thither, so that they too went over on dry ground. Elijah did that. He wasn't the only person that did something like that. It's like Joshua when he took the children of Israel across the Jordan, and the Jordan obeyed his command. Or even much further in the distance, it was like Moses, wasn't it, who took the children of Israel through the Red Sea. Now the river's being breached again by Elijah, who takes the two of them across on dry ground, which is almost the term of Exodus, isn't it? Yes, there are definite echoes of a new era indicated by the crossing of that river. Different circumstances, a new era. Something significant has happened. And of course, it's a miracle. It was upon dry ground. So Elijah and Elisha are on the eastern side of the river. It came to pass, verse 9, when they were gone over, that Elijah said unto Elisha, ask what I shall do for thee, before I be taken away from thee. Well, he did have at least that amount of thought, didn't he? He said, what would you like me to give you as a parting gift? And here's the man's mind. Elisha said, I pray thee, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. That's a beautiful statement, isn't it? That spirit's been denoted even in the New Testament. We referred to it earlier in Luke chapter 1, verse 17, where it speaks about John the Baptist, where he would come forth in the spirit and power of Elijah. There it is. That's that very spirit. And Elisha is requesting that he be given a double portion, not because he was greedy, as it were, or wanted to show himself greater than Elijah. I'm sure that wasn't the point. It was a sense of necessity. He felt the enormous responsibility of that office. He truly honoured Elijah's duties and the way he'd gone about. He honoured that very, very great in the cause, of course, enormously. He burnt the rest of his life back home and left it behind. He wasn't turning back from that at all, but he just felt the dependency that he had upon God. If Elijah could do this, then he needed a double portion to be able to do the same thing. I think that's the sense of it. Do you think that's right? I think that fits fairly well. And so I pray thee, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. And it must mean too that he really did admire Elijah. And there had been that growth of the school of the prophets against all. Jezebel, Ahab, name the lot of them. Nevertheless, there's been a growth of the truth and the teaching of the truth in their community. And Elisha felt, even though he couldn't think of doing anything else in life, he did feel the need for God to be with him in a very comforting and powerful way. So he was, verse 10, it was acknowledged his request was a very good thing, but a hard one. Thou hast asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if thou see me when I am taken from thee, it shall be so unto thee. But if not, it shall not be so. Why did Elijah put that requirement before him? Why did he have to see Elijah go? Well, Elijah wasn't the only one that had seen what verse 11 describes as a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, verse 11. The prophet Ezekiel also, before he went on his mission, he saw the picture of the cherubim, of the glory of God, described in the sense of the cherubim, and this is very much similar, isn't it? I think what Elijah is saying, I want you to really feel the enormity of what you're entering into. No doubt that Elijah knew what was going to happen, that he would be taken up in this way. And so he wants the one that's coming up on his side, he wants him to really understand how close this is to the things of God. It's right in the very centre of what God is doing. His presence will be with you. It will empower you for good things. But it's going to determine your life in an unswerving manner. You will become to Israel God's working in the nation. I think that's the sense of it, don't you? If you put that together with Ezekiel chapter 1, I think it makes good sense. Elijah wanted Elisha to absolutely know how close he was to the work of God in Israel at that time. It came to pass as they still went on, verse 11, and talked that, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind unto heaven. Now that chariot didn't leave him altogether, did it? Because you remember the case which we'll come to tomorrow, where they were outside of Dothan, and Gehazi was scared stiff about the whole circumstance, because all these Syrians were around the breadth of the city. And Elisha prays that the young man's eyes might be opened, that he would see that there was more for them than there was for the Syrians. And he uses the expression, there is more on our side than there is on his side. And that's how it turned out, of course, to be. Phrase which is taken up by David in Psalm 55, where he speaks of the same thing, that his enemies didn't realise there was more for him on his side than were on his side. That really never left Elisha, in a sense. It may have taken Elijah, but nevertheless the power of that vision was now going to drive his ministrations. So it says, and he saw him no more. He took hold of his own clothes and rent them in two pieces. Took up also the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and went back and stood by the bank of Jordan. So they're still on the eastern side, aren't they? But the work's on the western side. They've got to cross Jordan. He's got to cross Jordan. He's by himself. There's no Elijah. There's no Elijah to just brush the waters with his mantle. What's going to happen now? Does he have to swim across? He tries God's hand. He took up also the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, went back and stood by the bank of Jordan, and he took the mantle of Elijah that fell from him. What a nerve-wracking experience in life, eh? To fit into the shoes of a man that for years you've greatly honoured, and now the responsibility is upon you, and you're there by yourself on the eastern side. And he smote the waters, just like his master had done, and said, where is Yahweh, God of Elijah? It was the verification of the double portion that he wanted, wasn't it? And in that sense, he received it here. Where is the Lord God of Elijah? And when he also had smitten the waters, they parted hither and thither, and Elisha went over. And here in this verse 14 and 15, I think we have the crux of this passage, of this chapter. When the sons of the prophets, remember they were left on this slight elevation over here, watching anything they could see. When the sons of the prophets, which were to view at Jericho, saw him, they've been watching every detail. They said, the spirit of Elijah doth rest on Elisha. And they came to meet him. The evidence is clear. The God of Israel has brought this younger man into the office. They came to meet him and bowed themselves to the ground before him. They saw the departure. They saw him come back. They saw the division of the river. They saw the chariot that went off and Elijah went. And they left with Elisha. And they come and they bow down before him. What an amazing record, my dear brothers and sisters. It's an amazing record, isn't it? How many times in the scripture have we got anything like this? It's amazing. And they said unto him, behold now, there be with thy servants 50 strong men. Let them go, we pray thee, and seek thy master, lest peradventure the Spirit of Yahweh hath taken him up, and cast him upon some mountain, or into some valley. Now what's absolutely stupid about that? They're supposedly concerned for Elijah. Wouldn't God be first concerned about Elijah? Is it likely that God's going to get hold of Elijah and wait till he's got enough altitude and then just toss him out onto the ground below? It was stupid, absolutely stupid. They must have felt highly embarrassed as they made the suggestion. But why did they make that suggestion? I suggest because they still were not really convinced. And now they were going to be under the command and ordinance of another prophet who perhaps more like their own age. To have to take it from Elisha, well, it's not really, this bald-headed man's not really like Elisha. It's not as big a character. Well, he probably wasn't in his younger days. So they said, look, we better go and just search around that we really got this right. But Elisha won't go with that. He said, ye shall not stand. So here's the first test, isn't it? Only come back from the river. Has God done for Elisha what he promised he would do or not? So these men go off, and they are off for 3 days, it says. When they urged him, verse 17, till he was ashamed, he said, send. All right, he said, if you won't listen to what I've said, we'll go and have a look yourselves. It's a waste of time, but if you must. They sent, therefore, 50 men, which I suppose was the same group we had over here in verse 7. 50 of them go off into the surrounding area, probably climbing the heights of Jericho and so on, of the valley of Jordan. When they came again, for he tarried at Jericho, he said unto them, did I not say unto you, go not? Because, of course, they didn't find him. And so Elisha makes the point to them, I told you not to go. So immediately, he's settling into the new situation of authority and direction, which they didn't think he really would have. And so the men of the city said unto Elisha, behold, I pray thee, the situation of the city is pleasant. And we're not going to go into that section. My dear brothers and sisters, I find that that disposition of Elisha is really what we need today, don't you? There's a person who was prepared to put a light to all the things that he had in life and to give direction to the teaching group. I mean, not everybody came to the school of the prophets and sat at their feet. I'm sure it didn't happen quite like that. But with time, it would have, in these various cities, it would have developed what Samuel had developed. He was in Naioth of Ramah. Ramah was really the city, and Naioth was like accommodation block. Naioth means dwelling. I don't think it just meant that when visitors came, they could find accommodation outside the city of Ramah. I think that it also meant that God dwelt there, because he did. The school of the prophets was there. I suppose they developed something like that in these other cities. And that must have been Elijah involved in those things, because he was the only one that was leading the group at that stage. Well, my dear brothers and sisters, there's a tremendous drive in that. When I think of the best things that's come along in recent years in our own body is the school of the prophets. Well, it might be a small comparison. But, I've seen young men come along to the school of prophets, in their really buffoon stage of life, like this group of boys down here. By the way, they were not young children at all. The word's used of Daniel when he went into Babylon. It's used of David when he was going against Goliath. No, they weren't kids, little children at all. They were buffoons. They were later teenagers who thought that they'd take the opportunity of having a shot at a new man. And they found that God had a solution. And I think that's important to notice. God had a solution. Elijah didn't touch them. Elisha didn't touch them. The bears came out of the forest and they dealt with these ill-mannered, buffoon-type people. And that, of course, is very much the atmosphere of a lot of what we see in our democratic countries today. Young people just doing whatever they want to do, no matter what. And if he's the head man of the school of prophets, we'll throw a bit of rubbish at him and see how you get on. That's more or less what is happening in some areas of Christadelphia. People just come, couldn't care less how they come. They treat the hall just like as if it's their backyard, perhaps something in their backyard at home. It's not good. We should respect the meetings. All of us. We don't have to be a show of expensive clothes and so on. But we must respect our meetings. And we must have our young people to know that respect means that you come in a way that is seemly in the worship of God. And that's not easy because the whole mood of the country, Australia and no doubt Canada, is against that. There's a lot of young fellows that are doing just like this crowd did here. A lot of young people today. Some of our own young people are sometimes like that. But they're not all like that. I had a class last night with some of your young people and they were exemplary in their behaviour and the manner in which they came. And I'm thrilled to see things like that. And I'd like to encourage all of us to not be fooled by the idea that it doesn't matter what you wear wherever you go. It's not true. Nobody would do that and go up to the president of the US or that. That might be actually more in keeping. But they would not dare to do that to a person high in office. What about when we come to our meetings before God? It's not a show, but nevertheless, there is respect. This story is of a young man who was prepared to burn his future and leave it as a little hill of ashes in the company of his mum and dad and say goodbye to them and devote himself to the work of the truth. And I'm absolutely delighted to see that in the school of the prophets and in other places, in our ecclesias, there are people that are developing a mind that's got that depth and sincerity. We need them. We need every one of them. And what comes to our shoulders is this, that we must think, are we developing young Elishas? Are we making room for young men to come through that can be taught the things of God in a strong, clear and emphatic way, a healthy way, and that can build our brotherhood so that when our master comes, there are something of the equivalent of these schools of the prophet which were there in the days of Elisha. Thank you.